4 years.
Okay,
wonderful.
Yeah, they made it.
I assume Russ is ready. They always lead us.
So, Wes is ready.
Okay. Sounds good. Hi, everybody. Thank you guys for coming today. I'm Eric Johnston, one of the Provost Teaching Fellows. Someone talking still? Okay. And so on the other campuses, if you don't mind muting during the first half of this session. The way that we're going to do this format is different than any of the other Provost Teaching Academy sessions. We're going to do 10 minutes at each of 3 different campuses, have 5 minutes of general questions, and then stop the presentation and have an individual conversation just with us. And each of the campuses are going to have their own individual conversations. And so 3 of us are going to be talking for 10 minutes about controversial subjects, because one of the key aspects about this is figuring out what works for you. And the things that work for me are not going to work for someone else. And the things that work for Karen are not going to work for someone else. And the things that work for Bertha might or might not work for someone else. But it's important to see there's a diversity of ways to approach talking about controversial subjects. Now, why do we want to talk about controversial subjects? Is because they're some of the most interesting, nuanced, difficult, complicated topics to get through. And right now, they surround us pretty much everywhere we go. The 2 aspects is your class might naturally have them, and so it's important to understand how to navigate them. But the second aspect is, even if you have a class that typically does not have a controversial subject, it's important to understand how to navigate them in case they come up. Because if you're intentionally avoiding talking about anything that might be controversial, that makes your class look inauthentic. That makes you look as if you're avoiding a conversation, and it delegitimizes your perspective to your students. So even if you never want to talk about controversy, you should know how to do it just in case it comes up. And so what I'm going to do is give 2 examples of how I've dealt with controversial subjects and the lessons that I've learned from doing it. One of them is a planned, intentional, I want to talk about a controversial subject. The second one is situational. Something came up and it had to be addressed and dealt with. So in terms of the intentional discussion of a controversial subject, I like discussing structural privilege. And as a white male, it's very difficult to do that. And it's very difficult to communicate to people what structural privilege is in terms of race or in terms of gender if they've never experienced it. And so how do? I discriminate against them. And I do it intentionally, and I do it with the permission of the university, but I do it with a specific agenda in mind. And so the way that we do this is in the 3rd week of the semester, the grading rules for that week are particularly unique. And so men get 77% of the grade that women get. White students have to show 3 forms of ID in order to submit their homework assignment. If you want to get credit on the assignment, you have to have your cheek cells collected and swabbed. If you're sitting in the back of the class, you have to turn in the assignment 2 days before anyone else. But if you don't want to participate in this, you can also just pay me $40. And then the next class comes around, and there's always someone that tries to get me fired every single year. And I love those students. I'm excited about those students. But when the next class comes, we say, oh, okay, this is public administration. Let's line up. Let's get those cheek cells collected. I need to see your IDs. Let's get going quickly on this. And nearly everyone shows up all the time, but 1 or 2 always will protest. And they say, I'm not doing this. And so I talk to them about it and say, if you don't do this, you're going to get a 0 on the assignment. And they say, I'm fine with that. And so we agree that they're going to get a 0 on that assignment. They do end up getting a 0 on the assignment. And at the end of the class, they all wait there wondering what this was about. And so they ask, okay, why did we do that? And I say, this is public administration, not public policy. It's about operating efficiently under the rules that are in place, regardless of if we agree with them or disagree with them. They hate that answer. That is when they go to my dean, they go to the Office of Equity and Inclusion, they go to my director, and they try to get me fired. Because it is revealed the following week, where I explain that every single one of these policies come from current things that are happening within the world. They are coming from current policies in terms of voter registration. They're coming from TSA policies. They're coming from immigration policies that are taking place. And if you guys are so frustrated about this on one assignment of one class, can you imagine the people that are living with this situation? And that really is an eye-opening situation for them. But in order to pull this off, there's a lot of preparation that goes in front of it, and that's what I want to talk about. The first aspect about teaching controversial subjects is it takes a lot of extra care, time, and attention instead of just, I threw this together randomly on a dare, which I did not throw it together randomly on a dare. But the other aspect is By the second class of the semester, I know everyone's name. They know that I'm invested in this class. They know I'm paying attention to this subject, and they tend to give me a little bit more slack because they can anticipate that we're trying to do things in a different way. The other big aspect is if you're thinking outside the box in one of these situations, work with your faculty, work with your director, work with your dean to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And so in the creation of this assignment, I went to the assistant dean of research, or not research, assistant dean of students, and I said, this is what I'm planning to do. What do I need to be aware of? And her two things were you cannot benefit from the money, unfortunately. And then the second was they need to have an opt-out. And so you need to have the ability to drop this assignment without them negatively affecting the grade. And so both of those went specifically into the syllabus and went into the assignment. The other thing that happens is every single semester that I do this, I notify everybody before it's about to happen. And so they know to be on alert that week of you're about to hear about what's going to come. In every single year, 1 or 2 people reach out to a dean, a director of the Office of Equity and Inclusion, et cetera, and then they say, just wait a week. Give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, this has not necessarily hurt me overall. At the current moment, as of this morning, I'm the #1 Rate My Professor teacher at ASU. And so you don't have to worry about engaging in these difficult conversations, but that leads to the second aspect of how do you approach the conversations when they come up in class. So I teach a public administration and public policy class, and I had a class 2 days after last election. And some people were concerned about how are we going to navigate that class. And it was wonderful because they approached my class like the Daily Show, wondering sort of what is the take that is going to happen within this class. And what we focused on was trying to understand the different perspectives of the different groups of people that are affected. And so if you were a Trump supporter, why were you exuberant about this? What did you think that the Democrats were thinking? Why do you think that they're protesting? Do you understand where they come from? Do they have legitimate perspectives? If you're a Democrat, do you understand why people might have voted? The easy explanation was racism, but that's only one explanation. What are the other explanations that are possibly there? Could it be the deindustrialization of this region? Could it be the lack or the split between productivity and wages? Can it be the fact that society is changing faster than you're comfortable with? Can we see their perspectives as legitimate? And over again, what you try to do in these situations is you focus on understanding the situation. You focus on understanding the logic that supports the different ideas. Is it supported by evidence? Where does it come from? If someone has a very controversial statement, decompose it. Try to figure out where that's coming from. What are the sources that they're using? What's the evidence that they're focusing on? But focus on the issue as the locus of the conversation instead of, I am going to win this argument. The argument is never about the professor. The argument is always about the quality and the nature of the argument and the logic and the understanding of what's going on within that space. And so if you can depersonalize it, you can sort of escalate any intense situation. The final brief example that I have is this year we had Colin Kaepernick that was refusing to stand during national anthems. And I have a bunch of veterans within my class. And they would talk about how frustrated it would make them. And I had one that lost his temper in the class. And he said, if I were to sit during the national anthem, that is a disgrace to my military, that's a disgrace to my country, that's a disgrace to every single person in here. But the question was, that's what it would mean if you were to sit. What do you think it means if he sits? Because there's interviews with him. We can understand it. We can try to figure out what's happening. Do not assume that your action and your motivation for your actions translate over to everyone else. And so can you tell me his perspective, where he's coming from and what he's trying to accomplish with this? And that helped to diffuse the situation. And that's, again, what you always try to focus on, is can you empathize with the other people that have different perspectives? Can you see them as legitimate? Where are they coming from? What evidence do they have? And then by understanding that, what do you care about this subject? What is your evidence? What do you think is going to happen within this space? Now, that's my 10 minutes. And so I look forward to continuing this conversation, but I want to hand it over to Bertha, who has a very different class, a very different identity, and a very different perspective of how to approach these types of challenges. Bertha?
Hi, Eric. You guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, cool. Thank you so much for everything that you said. So thank you all, for my colleagues, for coming. So just a brief introduction for people who don't know who I am. I'm Bertha Mannanen. I teach philosophy here at the West Campus. In particular, I teach applied ethics, medical ethics, and religion. So I cannot not avoid controversial subjects. Some of the things that, just so you can get an idea for some of the things I teach, abortion ethics, legalization of euthanasia, universal health care, cloning, ethics of genetic engineering, and fetal research. So I just taught, what's today? Wednesday? I just taught yesterday about Planned Parenthood selling aborted fetal tissue, and what would they be used for, and could there be legitimate reasons for it? Vegetarianism, environmentalism, racism. Does God exist? If there is a God, why would he allow so much suffering? So all I do is teach controversial issues. So I cannot avoid it. So what I wanted to do today briefly is talk about my brief teaching philosophy on how I approach these issues, and how I've conducted my assignments in a way that I think hits the points that I want to about when being steeped in controversial issues, and then end with like a story, like the worst story I've ever had, like the worst example where I really was tested in my ability to do this, and go from there. So one thing that Eric and I and Karen and I disagree on is, do you reveal to your students what your personal views are in the classroom? And my choice is that I absolutely do not do that. I always tell them the very last day of class when they've turned in their papers, if they really care about what I think on these issues, to ask me after grades are done. And then I think like one person a semester does it. So I don't think they actually really care. But the reason I've chosen to do this, there are three reasons I've chosen to do this. One is that I genuinely worry that the students will not feel free to speak their minds on whatever issue it is if they know that it's not the issue the professor agrees with, right? I try to remember about what it felt like when I was a college student, and I was the kind of student that there's absolutely no way I would have out loud said something that I thought my professor disagreed with, right? For better or worse, that wasn't a reflection on them, that was more a reflection on my insecurities. And so I don't want to put them in that position. The second point is that I think that, I always teach multiple sides of an issue, and so I feel that if a student knows which issue I'm personally aligned with, they're going to read my defense of that issue as, well, of course she's defending it, she agrees with it, right? And the opposite, if I were to reveal to them that, that I'm a Catholic, they're not going to take anything I have to say about atheism seriously or things like that. So I don't want that to happen either. And the last thing, I actually have evidence of that. My worry is that on their papers, on their assignments, right, because my goal in all my classes is whatever position you hold on these issues, my goal is not to change your mind on those issues, is to make sure that you are better critical thinkers and arguers when it comes to that issue, right? And I cannot do that successfully if the students are writing their papers based on what they think I want to hear. And so one example I'll say about is one of the classes I teach is the freshman human event here at the West Campus. And the last one I taught was like 2 or 3 years ago, and I came in once wearing a shorter pair of pants, and my students noticed I have a tattoo of The Lion King, one of my favorite movies, on my ankle. And we got into this little discussion on, The Lion King, Disney, so cool, whatever. I didn't even think of anything of it, right? Pre-class conversation. I can tell you, out of 25 papers, 15 of the papers after that conversation talked about The Lion King somehow. It was amazing how they did it. And it was a paper on like Augustine's Confessions, right? So it wasn't even anything that was obvious, but they somehow included it. This is just like Mufasa tells Simba about the circle of life. And they're like, no, it's not. It's nothing like that. And I would put that in the margins. It's nothing like that. I know what you're doing. So this is just evidence for me that this is what they'll do, right? And so those are the reasons I choose not to reveal my personal stances on these issues. In terms of my assignments, I think one of the things that Eric said was absolutely straight up, completely right, is that I think it's important to depersonalize the position from the person. And I think that's something that, in general, as a society, we haven't been able to do very successfully. So, when I attack a position, I'm attacking the position. I'm not attacking you as an individual, as a human being. How can I do that in my classroom? How can I get across that position? And so I structured my assignments to psychologically do this for the students. And so one assignment that I have them do is they have to do these reading responses, right? They have to read the literature and they have to give me a one-page response on what they thought about the literature, and it's really there to test whether they've done the reading, right? They have to incorporate citations and so on. But what I tell them is that I'm not going to grade you on content. I just want to see that you did the reading. That's the only grade. If you show me that you did the reading, you get an automatic 10 points for this. But if you think this is the best thing ever written, tell me. If you think this is the worst thing ever written, tell me. If you completely disagree with them, and you just tell me. And I never grade them on that. I never grade them on the content. I always grade them just illustrate whether or not you've done the reading. And that's where they feel completely free and open to express themselves completely. So if I'm teaching about vegetarianism, there's a hardcore carnivore there, and they want to say, I think Peter Singer's absolutely full of it, they can say that. They can say that in that reading, in that assignment, and they will not be graded down on that. And so that gives them, they feel like I'm hearing them, and it's okay for them to say those things. And so that's one assignment that I let them just say whatever they want to say. But then in terms of like the more pressing assignments for the class, I typically have 3 larger papers, big paper assignments. 2 of them are critical papers, where they have to pick an argument that we've read in class, explain the argument, summarize the argument, and then tell me what's wrong with the argument. The reason I make them do it twice is because they have to do it with one article they agree with and one article that they disagree with, right? So, and of course, the article that they disagree with is always the easier paper for them to write because they disagree with it. But then I make them do it again because I want to push the fact that it's not the conclusion that you need to be worried about. Is the argument a good argument? And that it's perfectly possible to agree with someone's conclusion and still think their argument is bad. And so this emphasis on the logic of an argument rather than the argument itself or the person making the argument, that is pretty successful with that assignment. And then after a whole semester of them telling me everything that they thought in these reading responses and then critically analyzing arguments in these other 2 assignments, their final assignment is that their argumentative paper. They can argue any position in the class that they want of any of the issues that we've talked about. They want to be pro-life, argue pro-life. If you want to be pro-choice, argue pro-choice. If you want to say that cloning should be allowed, do it. If you want to say cloning is an abomination, do it. Right? So I let them argue whatever perspective they want, but I will grade them the way they graded the authors in the critical paper. And so, again, it's an emphasis that I'm not looking at your conclusion. I'm looking at, can you argue your position effectively? And so I spent the entire class doing exactly what Eric says, depersonalizing the issue from the person. That has always proven to me to be pretty successful. They don't, and so when I present difficulties with their position, they understand that I'm not attacking them as people. And that's, again, I have never had, as of yet, knock on wood, a situation where a student has complained that they feel that I am personally attacking them, right? And one thing I tried this semester, and it worked, so I'm going to try it for subsequent semesters, is I was really, especially after the election and the mood and the aura, I was really scared, for lack of a better word, to discuss issues of like institutionalized racism and things like that. I'm not as brave as Eric is on this issue at all. And so I was really worried. I was really scared. I typically teach this article about white privilege. It does not go over well. And I don't think I can teach it well, honestly. And so I'm like, what do? I still want to teach this issue, but what I do? So I'm currently writing a book chapter for a book on teaching philosophy to children. So like, oh, okay, and so that gave me an idea. And so I taught not the entire, but a good portion of the section on racism using Dr. Seuss books, right? And so the students were like, hey, this is so much fun. Like we're going to talk about cartoons and whatever. And they're surprisingly deep, right? The ones that I picked are surprisingly deep, and then I did an entire presentation where I talked about the history of Dr. Seuss, and he has, a really morbid racist history, which people are typically surprised to see, and how he considered a lot of his books to be an apology for his racist views. And so it was interesting and so the class came completely with their guard down, and there was so much more depth in that material that they realized. So we had this phenomenal discussion on institutionalized racism. And it was just interesting how nobody got their guard up, nobody had anything, and it's just because we kept saying, well, how would this apply to Horton, or how would this apply to the Steeches, and so that was successful, and I'm going to try to do that again. And so I'll end with some like takeaways, right? one of the takeaways is that I find that students are generally much better persuaded by reason that they themselves discover, right? Don't tell them you're wrong. Have them lead to that on their own. So like if they say, here's my position on X, and I'm saying, well, you know, if you believe that X is true, it leads to these conclusions. Do you think these conclusions are true? And then they'll say, no. Like, okay, well, then what do we do about your previous conclusion? And you let them sort it out, right? So instead of me saying X is wrong, I would say, if X, then Y. Do you agree with Y? No, I don't agree with Y. Okay, well, then let's talk about X again. And that seems to work as well. And get them to the position themselves rather than you telling them that their position is right or wrong or whatever. And so then I'll end with, and then I'll hand it over to Karen, I'll end with my worst example. So a few years ago, I had a student, and already I had gotten some, he behaved oddly in class. He didn't really talk to the others. He was very to himself. He was always in the corner. You know, his writing was odd. I eventually ended up, advising him to go to the counseling center and things like that. But I thought that he was a sensitive student, right? There was a delicacy about him. And at one point we were doing abortion, and for the first time he raised his hands and he just let it go. He goes, I think women that get abortions are murderers and they're sluts and they need to keep their legs closed. Bam. Bam! And of course, like, all of the women in the class were like, you could tell, like, they were already starting, and my brain was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Like, how can I, and so the first thing I did is, again, something that Eric talked about, is I'm like, okay, all right, stop, like, and like, let's go through what you said, right? And so I put up these terms on the board. I was like, well, women who get abortions do it out of convenience. What does convenience mean? Let's define convenience. Women who get abortions are sluts. What do you mean by that? Are we saying that women should not be allowed to have sex, blah, blah, blah? Women who get abortions are murderers. Well, what do we mean by murder, blah, blah, blah? And so, of course, he wasn't able to respond to those things because this is a completely irrational statement. But by putting it up on the board, I feel like I simultaneously made him feel that I was listening to him and yet also showing the rest of the class why he's wrong. And so instead of shutting him up and saying, I did say, let's keep that type of language is not allowed in class, whatever, but let's talk about what you said. And so by doing that, I feel I was simultaneously able to affirm him. And again, I feel like he was a delicate student, and I don't think it would have gone well another way given the demeanor that he had in class. But at the same time, of course, I showed not just him, but the whole class why these statements were problematic, right? So I will end with that, and then I will hand it over to Karen. Thank you.
Okay, here I am. Thank you. Hi. I'm Karen Brune, and I'm an honors faculty fellow at Barrett, the Honors College at ASU. I'm on the Tempe campus. I've been on the Barrett faculty since 1998, and my main teaching responsibility is to teach multiple sections of the human event, and this is Barrett's signature course. It's a year-long seminar required of all first-year honors students, and throughout the year, we analyze enduring ideas, organized chronologically, from a variety of disciplines and texts. Texts are broadly defined to include art and film and things. So students analyze political, cultural, religious texts containing ideas that many of them find controversial, if not downright offensive. And I've taught over 100 sections of this course, and most days I love it. So most days. I want to share with you what's worked for me in that context. I think that the most important word that I said in my introduction is analyzing. We are analyzing. I think that developing analytical skills is what makes it possible to address controversial issues productively. I make it very clear to the students from the beginning that the goal, the learning outcome, if you will, is for students to develop analytical skills. one of the most important things I teach my students is that opinion/reaction is not the same as analysis. And they must learn to recognize the difference in themselves and in others' discourse. And of course, I must distinguish between those two things too, in order to be an effective teacher. Part of effective analysis is the ability to present one's analysis effectively during discussion and in written work. So for my assignments, they are graded on participation, and I have a rubric that emphasizes how well they analyze as to how well they do on their discussion. When it comes time to write papers, and papers are at 50 to 60% of their grade, I make it very clear that I want them to argue about the text. I don't want them to argue with the text. I can't tell you how much I don't care whether or not an 18-year-old thinks that Plato's analysis of democracy is correct. I want them to analyze what Plato says. I want them to come up with non-obvious insights about this text, point out unexamined assumptions, make connections between different portions of the text that perhaps the author has not made, pull out the implications, and make those implications explicit. Can this kind of analysis produce critique? Absolutely, of course it can. But it is a critique born of analysis and not opinion. And I think that that is crucial to an academic exercise. Because this is an academic exercise, I tend to go with Bertha more than Eric when it comes to revealing my own positions and opinions, particularly to my first semester, first-year students, for all the reasons that Bertha outlined, which I think comes down to recognizing the power differential, which is another thing inherent in academic enterprise. One of the hallmarks, I think, besides an emphasis on analysis, is that we are operating with an inherent differential in teacher-student relationships. I think one of the many great things that students get out of Eric's class is that he makes that power differential so explicit that they are forced to confront it and think about it. But I'm very aware that when I impose my own view, I'm taking unfair advantage, I think, of that power differential, no matter how valid my view. I mean, sometimes students fight back, in the way that Bertha described, or they try to get you fired. But most of the time, they just shut down. They just stop listening. And if they think we are using our position of power, and I know that we don't always feel very powerful, but to them we are. And if we use our position of power to advocate for a position, I think that we are putting them in a position they don't deserve to be in. So in discussion or lecture, I am committed to assuming a posture of neutrality, or better yet, as both of my colleagues have talked about, playing devil's advocate. Argue everything, support everything, critique everything. And I think that students like it when I can be on more than one side of the position, and I hope that I am modeling for them how they can do it too. In my heart of hearts, I believe that skilled critical thinkers, those capable of analytical insights born of close critical readings, have no choice but to agree with me, because I am a critical, analytical thinker who is right. But I don't say that in the classroom, and I really hope that nobody, that I don't imply that in any way. I need to keep things to myself in the classroom. I need to keep a lot of things to myself, and I think that's wonderful. So my takeaways are three things. I always think that we should emphasize analysis over opinion. I don't think we always do in public discourse, but I think we should do it in the classroom. We should always be mindful of the power differential. And in particular, Bertha touched on this too, we need to make sure that, pardon me, that the student feels heard and not invalidated. You can set aside an opinion without invalidating that opinion. And I think it's very clear, very important that we are clear about that. So since my strategies all center mostly on analysis of text, I really emphasize to my students that there are lots of ways to approach a text. My degree is in religious studies, and my area of expertise is the history of the Christian traditions, particularly in pre- and early modern periods. So my scholarship/teaching centers on historical critical readings of religious texts that certainly can clash with religious convictions, and or even if the student is not particularly invested in a religious perspective, they're just very used to reading these texts in a devotional way. And it's sometimes very difficult to step away from that reading. So I spend a fair amount of time talking about extra-textual assumptions or connections, how they are appropriate in one context but not appropriate in another. We identify different ways of reading a text. So when someone wants to pull in a devotional reading of a text, I institute a discussion about insider versus outsider views and how both are valuable. But in this class, we're going to take an outsider view. But that's not to say that an insider view is somehow less valid. It's simply not appropriate here. I think we have to be very explicit about this, again, because of that power differential. I think students, undergraduates in particular, and that's who I deal with, really assume that when we emphasize a particular approach or method, we are implicitly denigrating another approach. And we may not mean that at all. So, I mean, this is just another aspect of Bertha's notion that we have to make sure that the student feels heard and validated. I will close with an anecdote, but I want to say that I realize not everybody agrees with me that we should separate out academic enterprise from, say, activism or working for justice. I mean, there's a real argument to be made that the boundary between critical thinking and activism should not be too definite. I've heard people make that argument, and that we should dissolve traditional barriers between research and political activism. I want to close with an anecdote about why I think that line should be firm. And it's not surprisingly about the election. So last October, November, I was teaching my human event, and as we were going into the last days of the election, we were also going into late medieval, early modern European texts. So nobody in my class ever mentioned Donald Trump. Those words did not come up. But we read Christine de Pizan's argument about how men constrain women to particular roles and then denigrate them for fulfilling them. We read Michel de Montaigne on how we construct the other. We read Shakespeare's play The Tempest and analyzed his ideas about what constitutes good political leadership and who should assume the responsibilities and privileges thereof. I felt completely satisfied that my students were preparing themselves to participate in the democratic process in the election in a very thoughtful way. Students have so many opportunities to air their opinions. They've got social media, they've got the coffee shop or the bar, or you know, there's so many places for that. I believe that when we teach controversial subjects, we are most effective when we preserve space where analysis rather than opinion holds sway. And I hope that we as teachers can help our students create that space and also recognize the value of that space. So that's my 10 minutes. What we would like to do is take a few minutes so that if anyone on a particular campus wants to ask a specific question of someone on another campus, this is the opportunity to do so. We'll spend about 5 minutes doing that, and then we'll shut off the technology and we'll just have a conversation on each campus.
We have a question from downtown.
Hi.
Yeah.
Okay. Bertha, what Dr. Seuss books did you use?
I use 3. 3?
Yep.
Okay. I use 3. I use the Sneetches, which is the one with some of them have stars on their bellies and some of them don't. And that was not just about, I mean, that one's obviously about bigotry, but it also has implications on how bigotry leads to economic disparity, because the Sneetches without the stars before and didn't have any food. And then it also, we talked about how bigotry can be used against people by people with power to exploit them. So part of the book is that there's a man that comes and says to the Sneetches without stars, here's a machine that'll give you stars, just pay me $10. And then at the same time he goes to the Sneetches with the stars and says, oh, now they have stars, here's a machine that'll take the stars out. And then there's like a couple of scenes where they're going in and out of the machine trying to regain their position of power, and it ends with that guy taking all their money and leaving. And so we had a discussion on how and they brought it up. It wasn't even me. They brought it up about how people in power exploit society's bigotry to keep themselves in power. They came up with that, right? I have to end that. So that was from Sneetches. We did the Butter Battle book, which is really about the nuclear arms race. But we talked about, because in the Butter Battle book, it's the same society who are divided over a cultural difference, which is how they butter their bread. And so we talked about cultural differences versus racial differences. And then we read Horton Hears a Who, because that one in particular, which I didn't know, I learned researching for this article I'm writing, is that Dr. Seuss had this really bad history of, he wrote a lot of racist comics during World War II, particularly against the Japanese. And after the war was over, he visited internment camps, and he visited Japan, and he visited the sites of the war, and he was actually, he was filled with remorse for having done this, and so he actually wrote Horton Hears a Who deliberately as an apology to the Japanese for the way he portrayed them. And so so he wrote it as a book about the consequences of dehumanization. So like when Horton is the only one that would recognize the Who's as persons, so he's the only one that fought to protect them. And everyone else that didn't recognize them as persons were about to commit genocide and about to kill them. And so we read Horton along with academic literature on the psychological consequences of dehumanization. And so we read them together. And so those are the ones that I picked.
Go ahead, Sharon.
I have a question for Karen. Karen, this is Sharon Hall. Hi.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi. I appreciate your idea of not telling people telling the students your opinions, but I think that it's pretty well known the probability of a university professor being liberal. So I think that the students already assume that coming in, and so I feel sometimes that if I don't acknowledge where my position is, I'm being a little bit stealth in my arguments. What do you think about this idea that most of us are likely to have a certain political position?
I think that's fair, and I think there's a difference between kind of acknowledging that you're a professor and so probably are somewhat left of center, and advocating for that position. And in fact, I think I have argued perspectives that are right of center to show them that you can do that. I would never lie about it and say, oh no, I have no political opinions, or no, I have no problem with Trump. But I really don't want to foreground that. I want to keep that in the background as much as I can without just being silly about it.
Great, thank you.
You have questions we have some questions here.
I just wanted to follow up on what you just said, that because I think I teach intercultural communication, and these things come up all the time. I think that what I find really important is having them see that contradictory positions can exist in one person. So that this idea that they have to have a completely clear, polarized view that eliminates everything in opposition to it, they can relax that and can live in the ambiguity that is within them as an openness to be able to hear more. And so when they know that I have certain kinds of positions, but sometimes I'll admit I don't agree with this, but I also agree with this within the same argument.
There was a question there.
Yeah, I guess I had a comment on that same thing. I teach political science, and I've also had the privilege of teaching a human event, which is nice. And I'll say the intensity of the gaze on me as an instructor in my politics is way more intense when I teach political science than when I taught the human event. So there are some differences there, I think. But one thing I want to go to Bertha's example of the Lion King tattoo. I find that sometimes the students are obsessed with trying to figure out where my politics are. And so to me, like, I heard the Lion King story and I thought that's because they were trying to figure out the whole semester, who you were, where you were from, what your deal was, and then they got the slightest little thing and then they latched onto it and it expanded into this enormous thing. I don't know if that's what happened in your case, but I've sort of had that experience, again, teaching political science classes where they're so interested to figure out, and I find it actually, to use your language, I find it distracting. Like, they're spending way too much time worried about me. Like, I don't want them to think about me. I want them to think about the arguments and all that. And I totally agree with what you said, of course, about arguing different positions. I taught at University of Michigan for a number of years, and it's such a pleasure to teach on this campus because I don't have to take the conservative view all the time. I don't have to take the libertarian view, which I had to do in these, in other settings. So anyway, I just want to throw in there that maybe sometimes they're obsessed about where we are politically, and that's something I've experienced.
Do we have questions from the other campuses?
Anything else?
If we don't, maybe
I have a question.
Okay, we have a question for another campus.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Bertha a question. I'm really curious, do you teach your class online, or do you only do it in person? And is what you teach transferable to being online if you don't teach it online?
I have never done classes online. I will hope I've never made to, although I think eventually I will. I'm of the opinion that it doesn't transfer well. Again, I'm biased because I've never done it, but the reason I think that is because, particularly in issues, I can set up a discussion board, I can do all those things, right? But particularly with these kinds of issues, I think part of the trick to teaching controversial issues well is to set up certain kind of rapport and friendship with the students, so they trust you to know that if Professor Madden is going to get on me about my pro-life view or my pro-choice view, she's not getting on me. I know we laugh and talk. I say hi to them. How are you doing? How's your personal life? And I don't feel like I can capture that as well online. And so that trust that I think is necessary to build the issue, to build a discussion on this, I just think it requires a face-to-face interaction. My husband teaches philosophy online. He doesn't like it, but he does it. So there's no, I haven't. I hope I never do. I don't think it will transfer over. I'm biased, and I may be wrong.
Thank you. Just a very quick question for Eric, because both Karen and Bertha talked about freshman classes. The PA class, was that a graduate level PA class or undergraduate? What level was that class?
That's an undergraduate level class where no one is taking it for the content.
We were going to have campus discussions. Do you want to have a campus discussion? You want to stop here and have a little discussion among ourselves before we break up?
One more who's been waiting for a while.
Yeah, I had a question for Bertha.
So something that I've been wondering while we've been having this conversation is, right, when I mean, I'm a Black German. When I teach a class on Black Germans and racism and implications, it just seems automatically students assume that I have a certain position, right, by virtue of the way that I look on my race. So I'm trying to understand if there's any, you know, whether there's something that y'all have ever thought about, how to approach it, right? Obviously, we argue both positions back and forth, but still there are other assumptions than if you know, you're sitting in a class with a white male professor or white female professor,
So, to be honest, this is an issue that I've encountered as well, and I don't know how to, I just don't know how to fix it or overcome it. I mean, I think one of the reasons that I was me personally, was very unsuccessful teaching about white privilege is for that reason. Right? I'm a Hispanic female. Of course she's going to think that. Of course she's going to think that. Right? And so and I've talked to this with other professors, and I have a really good, also philosophy friend who's a white female, and he said, I never have that problem when I teach about white privilege. So it's interesting, like, so I have that issue too. I don't know how to overcome it. To be honest, I've taken the coward's way out, and I just don't teach those issues. I don't teach issues that I can be very obviously aligned with because of my gender, because of I'll teach a little bit about sexism in my applied ethics class, but not as much as I should. I don't teach about immigration at all. I mean, there's a whole section in my biomedical ethics books about if we had universal health care, would it apply to illegal immigrants? I don't touch that with a 20-year-old, right? Because I don't feel I'm I have to figure it out. I know that's impossible for you to do, given your teaching, so I'm not very helpful with that. I agree with you that it's a problem. I haven't been able to find a solution.
I think we're going to...
Karen, the final thing is we have a lot of content at the Provost Teaching Academy, and including sample assignments about empathy, about critical thinking. We have articles that have been written about this sort of content, but not just for this session, but every single session the Provost Teaching Academy has done. And this video will also be placed up there within a week. So thank you, guys.
Bye.